Well, I will show you this beautiful piece of furniture a little bit later on down the line. But let's go ahead and start with the Pilgrim era. And what I'll do with each one of the eras of design is to show you the architecture that would go with it and to flesh out a little bit of the background of the era and then a few interiors as well. And then we'll talk about some of the furniture makers and why the furniture looked the way it did. We are primarily influenced by European elements, although I will include some Asian and African inspirations as well as we go through our periods. But for the most part, we have a lot of European influence. So, of course, we all know the story of the Pilgrims landing in Plymouth in 1620, and a recreation village has been established in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Now it's called Plymouth Patuxent Museums after the Native Americans who lived there. And the group that got off the Mayflower was only about half of them. Sadly, many of them had died from the elements and other problems that had occurred for this group that had come from England. And so, just to establish themselves with some huts was of primary importance, and furniture would come a little bit later. We will find that there is a regionality about furniture in America, especially on the East Coast. And what the pilgrims brought with them was very simple. There was no furniture brought over. They were just trying to survive. So it was basically just food and clothing, and that was about it. And so as our city started to develop, then we'll find that there are furniture makers and silver makers and clothing makers, etc. And so what we're looking at here is very, very basic furniture that would have been made here in America. So furniture did not come over on the Mayflower or any successive trips that had come over. This is a recreated area that we're looking at in Plymouth Patuxent, but certainly the pieces are authentic. And many of the museums back east, of course, have examples of this pilgrim furniture. You may also hear it called Jacobean, and that would be a term that I'll type in the chat box that would come from the Latin name for James. James the First of England. So Jacobus was the Latin term for James, and that's where the term Jacobean came from, as many of these people had come from that era of James the First, and of course his son Charles the First. And we're looking at very simple chests, very simple chairs and tables and stools. The idea of furniture was an idea where just the simplest of seats for us to sit upon was what regular people would have had. Any sort of elaborate carving would have been for the upper classes or the king and queen. So, yes, this is quite simple furniture. And there were very few elegant elements about the furniture, one of them being what are called turkey work carpets that were not used as carpets because they were too expensive, but rather as tablecloths, where you and I might use the term a Turkish carpet, they would use the term turkey work. And that would have been a luxury to have something like that. And in the back, you can see some pewter. Americans would use this kind of silver with a tin alloy in it, as silver will eventually develop, but silver is fancy stuff. This is pewter, and it's not quite as outstanding as a shiny silver plate would have been. These types of chairs we would have seen in Renaissance England. So basically, what we're looking at in the Pilgrim era is the furniture that would have come in the Renaissance era of the 1500s and up to about the middle of the 1600s. When the Pilgrims came to America, you can imagine that they were just overwhelmed with the amount of wood in the forest that was available to them. But they stuck with oak primarily because that was the wood of choice in England. It's very solid, very sturdy. And even though we had lots of cedars and other types of wood, these were English people that wanted to work in the style that they already knew, those people who were furniture makers in their native England. And we'll talk a little bit about construction as well. So, as time develops and the pilgrims have now had a generation or two of children and grandchildren, and the cities have established themselves, or maybe at this point they're still towns. And now we have the first period style of architecture. And this would be like the more elaborate farmhouses that we would have seen in the towns of England. And by the way, there's a couple little quirky aspects about this style of architecture. There is an overhang because in England, the taxes were based upon the amount of square footage that hit the ground, and therefore trying to fool the tax man a little bit, that we had the overhang, which would give you a little bit more room on the second floors. Now, we were not taxed that way here in America, but old habits die hard. And you've made a very good point about that it looks Nordic. Absolutely. In these cold areas, such as in England and the Scandinavian areas and German areas, that of course you need the A-frame roof line so that the snow would slide off. And then also a red door would imply that we have daughters of a marriageable age. It's kind of the early Match.com. Now, it sounds a little weird when I say it, but these are small communities. And of course, you want to not intermarry because of the problems that occur there. So as people were moving into the areas, new immigrants, this was a way to say, let's join families. So the interiors now, we still see a lot of the pilgrim furniture, but now the furniture will become a bit more elaborate with the carving. We're now establishing ourselves as the towns and the cities, and now we've got the various stores and the various industries. In the ironworks house, one of the few industries that the Brits would let us have on a larger scale was iron smelting. At the time in England, there had been a tree rot, there had been a disease. And so the wood that was needed to keep the fires going of making iron, we had plenty of it. Now, here we have something called a great chair. You can see that it's descended a bit from this chair. And a general term for this kind of chair is a wainscot chair. And let me type that into the chat box. A wainscot is any sort of area that you've got on the wall, and there's a variety of different definitions for it. So if this were an area where there'd be wood underneath the chair railing, that would be beautifully carved in English design. So when you have a chair with a carved back like that, that's a wainscot chair. But this one's a pretty elaborate one, and that's where it may also have the term of a great chair. I love this little baby's high chair in the corner. Note the straw or the long grass that would have been used to weave the seat to it. So as if you think about like where swamps are or where cattails are, there's long grasses, and they would have woven them, and then it would have dried, and that would have made it hard. Even in the beautiful chest here, you'll see that there's also kind of a blue and white porcelain. There, of course, was also ceramic making, but very much influenced by Chinese design, as the Chinese had come to the court of Louis the 14th in the 1680s, and everybody loved this new kind of design. And so the Chinese emissaries had also gone to England, and eventually we will have more of these Chinese export porcelains come into America although this is more of a kind of saltware jar. And of course, the very large fireplace. This would have been maybe just one or two rooms on the first floor, one or two rooms on the second floor, and this would help to keep the rooms warm. They're very low ceilinged because not only do you want to keep the warmth in, but we are larger as a human race. These people were much shorter than we are today. And of course, medicine and better living, better health has allowed us to grow as a human race. Now, in the upstairs, it's sort of a combination of a bedroom and a parlor. And of course, this is a museum, so things are arranged a little bit differently than what it might have been when somebody was living here. And notice the chairs that are very simple chairs, and they're called farthingale chairs. And the reason for that is a farthingale is the hoop underneath the skirts that the women would have worn. We can even see a portrait with a woman who's got a lot of skirts there. And when you sit on one of these chairs, if there had been arms, you would have kind of crushed in with all of your skirts. So this allows you to have a little bit more room. And then I don't know why the fabric does not pull all the way around the bed, because normally you need to keep the warmth in and privacy. And then also we have a little chamber pot at the bottom in case you need to get up and go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. The types of chairs that we see are extremely simple. And again, this would have been from the very early Pilgrim era, and what is called a carver chair, named after Governor John Carver, is just some very simple turned styles. And I'll tell you about how these were made in just a moment. We'll talk about the construction. And another one on the right, this one having a leather seat, and this one having a rush seat, R-U-S-H. Oh, question here, sources of the green pigment. Thank you for reminding me about that. That's a great question. This, of course, would be modern fabrics. We tend to think of the pilgrims as very sour and dour and colorless, and that's not true at all. That's really kind of a Hollywood way of presenting them. Their favorite colors were reds and greens, and they dressed in a simple dress, and there might have been some very simple dyes. And that's another great rabbit hole to go down to, is how do people obtain dyes? And it can be from a variety of ways. For example, in Native American design, it would come from onions, which would give you yellow and purple, or various kinds of cornflowers that would give you blues. The colors here are rather bright, and fabrics, to make a long story short, might have been brought over from England, or even a little bit later on from France. Again, the Brits did not allow us to have our own textile industry. You could weave it individually for your own family, but they wanted to make sure that we were financially dependent upon them. And at this point, Europe has many more advancements in dyes and colors and things like that. So this, although a modern fabric, was likely brought from England at the time. So to answer your question, green pigment can come from a variety of ways. Malachite crushed up is one way. It can come from green earth, which is kind of a clay pigment. Copper gives us a very poisonous green. So I'm sure you've all seen something turn green, the verdigris, the patina that it gets. And again, a whole field. Maybe I'll propose to Michelle a history and mystery of color. So here we have just some very simple turnings, and the connections are made through, as I've got an image for you in just a few minutes, of mortise and tenon, where the sections are put into a channel, as you can see right there in the leg. And so I've got a better image for you in just a moment. Now, the Brewster chair was named after Reverend William Brewster, one of the most important members of the religion at the time. And so his is a little bit more elaborate with all of the spindles. Some of them have been lost here, but there would have been spindles all the way around. So appropriate for the religious leader of the colonists. And then a slat back armchair. And some of this may look like shaker furniture to you, and you're absolutely right. The shakers didn't come about until the 19th century as a community, but certainly we see the simplicity of the types of furniture that we see echoed in the shaker community. And here's an example of a wainscot armchair, and that wainscot referring to the back panel that was carved in the way that you would see in an area underneath the chair rail if that's the way your home is decorated. So above the chair rail, you might have some wallpaper or paint or whatever, and below the chair rail, we see the wainscoting. So here's an example of how the furniture was put together. The mortise and the tenon, in this case, it's a square example, which would have been used for chests and things like that. It could be a kind of round mortise and tenon, such as we see with the connection here. Now, the dovetail, that would be used for drawers. And also to keep the piece of furniture from falling apart, you might have a little pin that's put into the mortise and tenon. Nails were to come a little bit later as a letter coming from one of the pilgrims traveling on the Mayflower back to England said, please send glass and nails and everything else so that we could continue to build our homes. So here's where the pin would go in order to anchor the mortise and tenon. And then here's the various types of turnings that we would have found. And the English are very much into turning. I'll talk more about French furniture a little bit later and other kinds of cultural furniture. And here is a wood turner at his lathe. He has a shuttle going, and he puts his piece of wood into a bracket so that he can get that shuttle going, and they can turn the piece of wood around to give it these various decorations. This one in particular is called a barley twist. And the barley twist, or even any of these, this one's a really quite elaborate. The barley twist comes from how ale is made in England, beer. And when you think about making ale that will become a liquid, it's got barley in it and hops and other grains and everything. At first, it's kind of syrupy, just like if you were making fudge or candy, or the way that we would maybe drive our parents crazy by taking the maple syrup bottle and kind of swirling it over our pancakes, and our mother's panicking, thinking that that syrup's going to get all over the place. That curliness is what we see in making ale. And everybody drank ale, even babies drank ale, because in England at this point, industrialization would have poisoned a lot of the rivers. Although our rivers were probably quite clean at that time, old habits die hard. And so they would have thought that the rivers would have been not clean, and they would have boiled their ale, and everybody would have drank that. Now, as we are continuing on in the elaborateness of the furniture, here is another fireplace that would keep the house warm as well as where we would cook. Here is a heating pan that you would put underneath the pilgrim version of a comforter or your bed, and that would help to keep you warm in the middle of the night. And then over here we can see either some Dutch Delft type of plate, or perhaps this is a Chinese export porcelain. And then note this kind of detail in the cabinet. It's called a cup and cover. In England, it represented the chalice that you would take your communion from, that you would drink the wine from, and a cover to it. So the bottom of it is like a big wine glass, and that was a very common decoration in English furniture at the time. And by the way, there's the red pillow. So red and green being very popular colors. And here's a close-up of that particular cupboard. Now, how would you tell the difference between an English cupboard and an American cupboard? Well, a lot of it has to do with people who are experts in these things. Some of it will depend upon the wood, that a wood may be available in America, but not that same type of wood in England, and vice versa. There are people who are experts on woods and can tell you about these things. There are experts who can tell you on the way a particular leg is turned, or as we go a little bit further into our slides, even the way that there is a ball and claw type of foot that will distinguish the various regionalities in furniture. Now, economy of scale was important. These are individuals who are coming from Europe, where it was thought that if you push your furniture against the wall, that would make your room look bigger. And if any of you are interior designers, then you'll know that the way you arrange the furniture will help to guide our eyes a certain way. And again, these are Puritans, these are pilgrims. Actually, there's a difference between the term. You can be a pilgrim of any religion. The Puritans were separatists. They were breaking away from the Church of England, and they were coming here for religious and economic freedom. So in any case, I'll show you a close-up of this beautiful chest in just a moment. But look at this interesting table chair. And there's not too many of these in England, but we did find a few in America because of this economy of scale of the Puritans. And it's not very comfortable, I understand, to sit in, but it's this idea of combining styles that could either be a table or, as you can see here, a chair. Beautifully created. I mean, this is very lovely carving. And again, this is very simple furniture for very simple people. A good movie to watch is The Restoration with Sam Neill as Charles II. And there's some sections in there about the Puritans, those people who were separating from the Church of England. Why were they separating? They felt that the Church of England had become too Catholic. And the idea behind that is that Henry VIII had broken away from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England. And the Catholic Church, as many people had felt, was spending more money on decorating the churches and the Pope's apartments. And so they were breaking away. This is where the Protestants came from. But then many people, as I mentioned, felt that the Church of England was too close to the Catholic Church. And again, just speaking from an historical standpoint, no sort of commentary on my part, but what had happened sociopolitically of why these people were breaking away. There's a lot of charm to this chest. Oh, I forgot to put in that William Searle and Thomas Dennis were British who had come to America. And there's a particular charm in almost like a folk carving. And this will be an important part of American history is the folk art. We, just trying to survive, did not have any art schools or architecture schools or anything like that. Those actually didn't exist until about 1820. And so we're just simple folk trying to eke out a living, and then eventually we develop as a nation. And so this folk art would be a sort of self-trained art, or perhaps working as an apprentice with a painter or a carver who had trained in Europe. But either one of these individuals, and it's thought that Thomas Dennis might have been an apprentice to William Searle because the carvings are very similar. And then when we actually can attribute one of the piece of furniture to these individuals, then we can make those comparisons. The Brits generally did not sign furniture. The French will, because there's a different taxation system on French furniture. So this is why we don't know who a lot of the furniture makers were at the time. Either one of these artists includes a tree of life, as if we have a base here upon which this tree or this plant is growing. And then an interesting little figure eight type of design, which actually goes all the way back to Greece. It's called a guilloche. Type that into the chat box. Of this figure eight that we will see in Greco-Roman design, classical design, such as you would see in the carvings of the Parthenon and other structures like that. So very charming. And chests, of course, were important to keep your clothing in and to keep things from getting dirty, smoky, because those interiors, yes, could get a little smoky with the fireplace being open like this. And speaking of the regionality, the Hadley chest would be from the area of Hadley in Massachusetts area connected to the Connecticut River. And so the two drawers or any chest with drawers underneath it, the nickname is a Hadley chest. And also notice, again, the lovely folk carving, kind of some tulips here, as we also have Dutch immigrants. We'll have German immigrants. We'll have immigrants from many nations. And the tulips generally will tell us that this might have been a Dutch carver. Here is a very high-end couch of the time, one that has been covered with the Turkish carpet or turkey work that the Brits and the Americans would call this kind of patterning, and usually darker colors, reds and very dark browns, rust colors, a little bit of gold colors in there. You can see that this is the original fabric. Essex Institute in Salem has a lot of pieces of early furniture. Also, some beautiful turning down here with all of these orbs in a row. And that type of turning is actually called ball turning because these are a whole bunch of balls in a row. A gate leg table, that was considered to be one of the great inventions in England at the time. It came around 1660 in England. And so you can imagine, again, that economy of space being important. These leaves will fold down when you pull the leg in. So this leg will pull in, and you can see there's a notch that'll anchor into this leg, and then the leaves can fold down. This is a dowry or dower chest. And this was something that the Germans would use as a marriage chest. Now, when the Germans came, and a lot of them came to Pennsylvania, the people who were hearing the word Deutsch for German misinterpreted it as Dutch. So the Pennsylvania Dutch are primarily Germans. And so in their culture, they had these wedding chests, these hope chests. The Italians did as well. The French and the English, not so much as a wedding chest. They had storage chests, but these were a gift from a parent to a daughter. It could be a gift from a groom to his bride. And so this is very beautifully colored here. It's actually a reproduction. You can see that an artist reproduced an example of a real dower chest. There was a movement, I think sometime around the 30s, to give artists some work during the Depression. And so they had artists come in and give beautiful renderings of some of the pieces of furniture that we see. The National Gallery of Art gave this work to some of the artists. And so here we have these charming little kind of like tulip flowers and perhaps a name here for the young woman who would be getting married and then a date. Now, going on to the next period, we have the Georgian era from about 1700 to about 1780. Not a lot of building going on during the Revolution. And this is a kind of a brick house that would imitate the type of structures that we would see in England at the time. The forms will follow into America primarily through pattern books. So the Europeans, primarily the Brits, would send over these books with lots of pages on different styles. It could be for housing, it could be for furniture. And not only would these be instruction books, but also details. So there would be a detail on the types of dormers you see up here, how the windows would be placed. And so this would be kind of the country houses during the 18th century in England, Georgian era, because there were three Georges in the 18th century, George the First, George the Second, and George the Third, who we fought our revolution against. There's also a George the Fourth, but that goes into a different era in England. And so the Brits love classical design. So the triangular pediments, the eyelid pediments, symmetry. There was a huge love in England of classical ideas coming from Greece and Rome. And so on the inside of these houses now, we'll see some furniture that will relate more to the late 1600s in England. What we've been looking at so far is from about 1500 to about 1660 in England. That's our pilgrim furniture. That's the English Renaissance. Now, Charles II comes to the throne, and after a very difficult period under Oliver Cromwell, elaborate carving comes back now. And Charles II had been exiled in France, living with his cousin Louis XIV. And so Louis XIV furniture is going to be all elaborate and all that. We don't really follow so much of that Louis XIV furniture. It's still a little elaborate for we Americans, but the English version of the beautiful carvings, such as we see here, and new kinds of feet developing, which I'll tell you about, this will apply to England's Charles II, William and Mary, and Queen Anne. I know you've all heard of a Queen Anne chair, which I'll show you in just a moment. So here we have a wing chair, and that would be the sides of it would kind of keep the heat from getting too close to your face. The Brits and Americans didn't really put on a lot of makeup as the French did, because there's wax in makeup, and if you got too close to the fire, your makeup would start to melt a little bit. So we're primarily looking at Charles II and William and Mary furniture in here now. Charles II, 1660 to, oh dear, about 1680, I want to say, and then William and Mary, and then Queen Anne comes to the throne in 1702. And here again is your turkey work as a tablecloth. A question that usually comes up is, did they have this kind of ruffles? Yes, they did. So this is a little bit of fringe that's added on. And another example in Winterthur Museum. Now let me talk about these rooms that are created, period rooms that are created to give visitors a look at how a room would have been arranged for people at that time. And then also many houses or the rooms of houses have been saved as maybe the wrecking ball was going to come about with the Wentworth house that was originally in Portsmouth. So it's a way that the museums to be able to keep these panels together or the wood beams together. This helps to preserve them. Winterthur Museum is in Delaware, and it was created by Henry DuPont of the DuPont Chemical Company, who had a great love of early American furniture. The Winterthur Museum, I know it looks like Winterthur, but it's Winterthur, named after a house that he had someplace in Europe. And there's all of these period rooms from Pilgrim up right until before the Victorian. Evidently, he didn't like Victorian furniture. So here is a day bed that was very popular in the William and Mary period. And so we are imitating pretty much the same kind of furniture that the Brits were making at the time. There will be some changes, which I'll tell you about in just a few moments. Here's a very tall chair. The William and Mary chairs were very tall. Before them, Charles II, the chairs weren't quite as tall. This is more of a Charles II chair. The taller chairs are William and Mary. Now, William and Mary also had tall chests, but we have a little bit different version of them, which I'll show you. The fabric is very William and Mary style with these big leaves and big flowers. At this point, we'll start to see rugs on the floor. So more so in the 1600s, they were put on as tablecloths, and then we started to see some of the tapestries on the floor. All right, so this chair having a leather seat, which would have been very high-end piece. There's also the beautiful carving at the top. At this time, England has moved from their Renaissance period into their Baroque period. Baroque has lots of curves and a lot of elaborate details to it. And then we were looking at this similar chair in the image a few minutes ago. And this is more of like a knob foot. And this is called a triffid foot. So this is the creation of many different types of feet in primarily starting in the William and Mary period. So again, late 1600s. And this foot, the triffid, there's three sections to it, like there, it's almost like there's three knuckles there, and that indicates one of the William and Mary styles. And you can see that the carving is becoming more elaborate. And then a wing chair. Now, usually people apply the term Queen Anne wing chair, and it's not always a Queen Anne wing chair. The feet will tell us that it's a William and Mary wing chair. There will be different feet for Queen Anne. So the feet will help us delineate which particular style we're looking at. So here's that triffid foot again. Here's an example of the day bed, again with those kind of knob feet and elaborate carving. Now, in the William and Mary style in England, they would have had these oval stretchers underneath. There would have been kind of an oval section of wood between this stretcher and that stretcher, and another oval piece between this stretcher and that stretcher, and another one there. We don't really have those oval stretchers. Now, whereas the William and Mary in England tall chests would have had two humps to them because there's a king and a queen. Mary was British. She had married William of Orange in Holland, and the two of them came back to rule in England. So we've just kind of cut off the humps. So we have these two pieces. You might have heard the term highboy. for a tall piece of furniture. Bois comes from French for bois. Bois is wood, and you can see how somebody mispronounced that as boy. So a high wood, a high chest. And we got super fancy. The William and Mary chest would have gone all the way down to the ground, but we're going to establish this economy. And what I mean by that is that these were in two pieces. In England, it was one big chest. So, first of all, they're very tall, so you got to get them through the door. And you could separate these pieces. So this is like a block that fits right into this desk here, if you will. It's kind of hard to call it a desk because it'd be kind of hard to pull up your chair here. And sometimes people needed a little bit of money and they might sell the upper portion of the chest, and somebody would buy it who couldn't afford the whole chest at one time, and now they've got a nice top to it. Well, that may create what is called in furniture a bad marriage, where the top doesn't really fit the bottom. Here, this is all meant to fit together. You can see how beautiful the grain of the wood is, but sometimes the top look completely different from the bottom. Here's another example of these 6 legs that American William and Mary furniture has. And it also has a kind of lacquering on it because the Chinese brought over lacquered screens and Europeans learned how to lacquer. A specific kind of lacquering is called Japanning. And Japanning is a type of lacquer. It's just kind of a heavy, black, shiny paint. Lacquer comes more from the sap of trees or from bug juice that's then turned into this lacquer. And so, being very dark, this has probably been japanned. And notice how lovely the little details are, the little birds here. And so then, moving on beyond William and Mary, and now going into some more Queen Anne types of chairs, we're now looking into the early 1700s. This is, well, William and Mary might go on. It's not as if you wake up January 1st, 1700, and now we're going to do Queen Anne, but sometimes the time frames overlap into each other. So now the sloping shoulders of the Queen Anne style with the curved splat that you would lean your back against. And notice that it's also a solid splat. When it gets carved, that will go more into Chippendale. All right, now it's a little bit hard to see, but I've got some closer up images that we're going to have a ball and claw in some of the feet. And also notice this beautiful Delft blue and white porcelain that was used to line a lot of the fireplaces, and a camelback sofa. So a sofa with a hump in it. And of course, grandfather clocks and mirrors and all that. Here's just another view of the Reedborn parlor that will lead us into one of the chests. And I'll get to that chest in just a moment, but let's develop the chairs for a second. Okay, so here's it's kind of an elongated Queen Anne chair. A Queen Anne chair should be a little bit more rounded like you see here. And here we have a pad foot, P-A-D, just like a cookie. So that's very typical of Queen Anne feet. And again, Queen Anne in England, 1702 to 1714, when she was on the throne. Keep in mind that it takes a little bit of time for these designs to come to America. They got to come over on a boat. And here we have a trifid foot. So Americans are playing around with some of the feet. In England, the Queen Anne chair would have just had the pad foot, but we're going to get a little feisty here, and we're going to add some things that you might not see in England. The elaborate carving, the Brits will do this and will add to it as well. Beautiful shell on the knees. Now, shells in England are more connected to the seafaring nation that it is. In other parts of Europe, if you see a shell, it has more of a meaning of the Crusaders who were traveling and fighting in the Crusades, as well as people who were making pilgrimages to pilgrimage churches, such as in Spain, Santiago Compostela. And they were very poor, and so they would have a scallop shell that they would use to scoop up water, and then it eventually became the symbol of a traveling Christian, a fellow Christian. So you see a lot of shells in Catholic design as the pilgrims were making their Catholic pilgrimages. In England, because Henry VIII had kicked out the Catholics, it does not have a Catholic meaning here. It has a meaning of connecting to England being a seafaring nation. And we just pick up on the design. So Americans are picking up on the design. Now we go to the ball and claw. And we tend to think of this as an animal's foot or a bird's foot, but there's a whole different meaning about this. The ball and claw comes from an Asian influence. It is the dragon grasping a pearl. So as we have primarily Chinese influences at that time, we don't have Japanese influences until the 1870s. And so the dragon, the all-important symbol in Asian culture, and there's different kinds of dragons. There's Chinese dragons, there's Korean dragons, there's Japanese dragons. And so this is the dragon grasping the pearl of knowledge. Okay, and we'll see some more ball and claws in just a little while. And then we'll take a break in just a couple of minutes here. Here's this beautiful high chest that I had shown you back in this image. And in the bonnet top, just like a bonnet, let me get you a little bit closer here. We can see some of that beautiful gold leaf detail. Now we're establishing our cities, we're becoming wealthier. And again, the shell, which is a pretty image at this point. Okay, so it doesn't really have a Catholic meaning. And the broken section, what's called a broken pediment. So instead of being a triangular pediment, a fully formed triangular pediment, this one happens to have a bonnet top to it. There's a break in it. And there's a very special meaning of a broken pediment in America. In Greece and Rome, it just means that the building has gotten old and chunks have dropped off. Well, as we were forming our nation, as we were changing from the colonial period to becoming the American nation, this will have a meaning to us that we will base a lot of our architecture on Greece and Rome. We are hitching our wagon to the greatness of the Greek and Roman empires. Notice the columns here also. And so the democracy of Greece and the Republic of Rome, Greek philosophy, Greek mathematics, Roman building systems, Roman engineering. We want to be like them. And so we, of course, have based our country on the constitutional republic and democracy and all that. So the broken pediment is a reminder to us to not let this new nation break, to not go down the roads that Greece and Rome eventually did. Those great empires fell. So you would think that we'd want to have a full pediment in our designs, but it's a reminder to us that Greece and Rome did fall, and it's a reminder to us to not let that happen of this new nation. So that's where you'll find the broken pediment in many of the details, especially back east. And we too are very charmed and interested in Asian design. So the emissaries who had come to France and to England, there were imitation Asian designs. And at that time, what's called, and still is, chinoiserie in the Chinese style. It can either be actual Chinese objects that were used in interiors or a Westerner's interpretation of what Chinese design looks like. Nothing to do with cultural appropriation or anything like that. It was cultural appreciation. And then we have a lovely tea table with the edge so that you don't bump your tea off. Tea was expensive. That came from China. Now, of course, it's very inexpensive. And a beautiful little pad foot. So this would be like a Queen Anne tea table, although it's going much later in America. But these are the details that'll help you decide what era a piece of furniture is from. This is one of the pages that came from a book that Thomas Chippendale had printed, showing people his various designs. He was a British, as you can see, furniture maker, showing the various designs, how to put together the pieces of furniture, the instructions. Now, at first you would think, well, doesn't he want to keep all this to himself? Well, you can't really get a patent on anything like this. You can do a patent on a particular kind of joining or maybe like a zipper, something like that. So this was a way for him to make more money to sell his designs not only to other British furniture makers, but to Americans as well. And there were several people who would do this. So these are some of the drawings that would then become the Chippendale style chairs. Again, the Brits didn't sign a whole lot of things, so that's why I've used the Chippendale style. These are actually American chairs, so Chippendale never came here. But the carved splat and then the curvy railing, that will give us the Chippendale style chair. And there's many permutations of these, but generally a carved splat and this almost like a parentheses or a mustache at the top of the railing. All different kinds of feet. You don't necessarily have to have a ball and claw on a Chippendale. As you see here, this is just a very pretty little, what's called a whorl, like a butter curl. So just like a little curl back, or it can curl under as well. So that's a whorl foot. And speaking of those claws and regionality, this is an example of where the claw is placed on the ball. So Massachusetts, one of them might curl back a little bit. In Newport, there's a little bit of negative space. Some of them are flatter, some of them are more squarish. And even different designers had their little take on the ball and claw. And so Americans really ran with that. We really wanted to give our regionality to that. And Chippendale also gave instructions for tables and bureaus and what are called library desks, big desks. And so this has a little crimp like a pie, but also notice how gorgeous the carving is. Sometimes when people hear about American furniture, they just think, oh, it's that pilgrim stuff. Not at all. We had beautiful, elegant, subtle carving. We might not have a whole lot of gilt bronze mounts on our furniture, but we have just beautiful, subtle carving. These leaves and scrolls. And this one's a really beautiful, elaborate table. There's an image of this in a drawing in Chippendale's book, and that's why it's called a Chippendale style tea table with a very elaborate, what was called a gallery. The gallery would keep you from hitting your teacup off. By the way, I should mention that this kind of very frilly, leafy carving was influenced by Louis XV in the Rococo era. Louis XIV would be Baroque, and Louis XVI would be neoclassical. And then a card table, which folds over. This is what people did in the evenings. They played cards, they sang around the piano. And here is a place for you to put your little chits. And then here's where you would have your candlestick so that you could continue playing well into the night. And again, some beautiful carving here, a little Rococo style carving. That's what the French would call it. The Brits would call it Middle Georgian. So George the First is kind of Louis the 14th. George the Second is kind of Louis the 15th, and George the Third is kind of Louis the 16th. All right, now we'll go into the federal style, and that would be after the Revolution. So it's basically a Georgian structure, but now we add a welcoming portico onto it. So now we add in a little porch and a fan light, like this half moon called a fan light. It allows more light in. It was the influence of a variety of designers, Samuel McIntyre being one of them. And then up here is a balustrade. Especially on the East Coast, you would want to watch for your ships to come in, as shipping is a very important industry for America. And the interiors now after the Revolution will become classical, neoclassical. Note the columns and the garlands. And so much of this comes from the discovery of Pompeii in the 1750s. This was a big deal in Europe. It was the most well-preserved of all of the Roman villas. And so this, of course, will influence us, not only coming from Europe, but also because we are this new nation that we want to connect to the columns and the Greek and Roman vases. You can even see that in the backs of the chairs. There's kind of an open vase here. Medallions on the carpets, the Brits are doing those as well. Now, you would think that we want to break away from whatever the Brits are doing. No, a lot of our DNA is still British, and the design books are coming primarily from England. So I'll show you some close-ups of these chairs in just a moment. Here's another interior. We can see some of these after the Revolution chairs. Love this little child's chair here. And again, the kinds of columns in the fireplace. So the types of chairs we have after the Revolution are primarily of the Sheraton type, and I'll get to in just a moment, Hepplewhite. Now, these were two English designers that also sent their pattern books over. And these have straight legs to them. Chippendale has primarily curvy legs, sometimes straight legs, but these represent fluted columns. If you think about some of the columns you see in Greek and Roman design, and an arrow foot. All right. And then in the center is some sort of Greek or Roman vase design. And this is a page coming from Thomas Sheraton's book. Beautiful upholstery. We are using a lot of stripes at that time. And then also notice the nail heads, also in that garland style that we see a lot in Greco-Roman design. Look at how gorgeous that carving is there. And this was all done by hand on YouTube. There's a lot of explanations of how the subtle carving was done, and they must have had about 40 different instruments that they used, just with different blades on them. And then we have George Hepplewhite, and his are shield back chairs. Sheraton tends to be a square back chair, and Hepplewhite gives us these shield backs. Again, here's our garland and a Greek vase in the center, the nail heads in that swag design, straight legs, arrow foot, and sometimes some sort of design. Wheat is quite a common detail growing because at first we were an agrarian nation, so wheat stalks you'll find a lot in decoration. And again, here's some of the pages from George Hepplewhite's book. Sadly, he had passed away, and his wife, and I believe they had a son, a small child, that she sold his drawings in order to support herself. He never sold the book himself, whereas Sheraton and Chippendale and others had done so. So very lovely designs. Here is kind of a Greek drinking cup called a kylix that you find in a lot of the designs in the chairs. Painted furniture was very popular. It's a little bit more pink. I was trying to get a close-up, and it's a little bit different image. So here we also have a very feminine chair. There was actually 24 of these made for a family, and they've been dispersed to various museums. And this would be very Marie Antoinette style. She loved ribbons and flowers and feathers. And of course, the French had helped us in our own revolution. So even our clothing at the time is French inspired. Straight legs on this serpentine front, meaning the front is curved a little bit. Very lovely little detail done in a kind of burnt wood. I know it's a little pixelated here, but just to take little pieces of wood and dip them into hot sand would give you that shading. And even here, a little bit of inlay. And that's a whole process of cutting out a section of the wood and then putting in a different color of wood to give it a design. Then we go to the American Classical Revival era. You may hear it called the American Empire period. We don't use that term anymore because we fought a revolution over that to not be an empire. What that means is that this is influenced by Napoleonic furniture. So Napoleon's empire, 1804 to 1815. So the more common term now is American Classical Revival. And this is a pumping up of the federal style. Notice how much bigger the portico is in Monticello, incorporating a dome. Many of our Capitol buildings are based upon this kind of American Classical Revival type of architecture. And so we're taking our cues from Napoleonic furniture by way of an English designer and a French designer who I will tell you about in a moment, who came to America. But notice this curved leg. That is called a klismos leg. Klismos is Greek for chair, and it has a sword-shaped leg, a saber-shaped leg. Napoleon picked up on that, and it represents military might. So a sword leg would represent military might, that we have fought our revolution as Napoleon had engaged in his wars. Oh, seat cushions, horsehair was typical to stuff seat cushions with. That's a great question. Yes. So the British designer, actually Scottish, Duncan Fife. And Duncan Fife had learned about the Napoleonic furniture by the way of what the Brits will call British Regency style. And that would be George the Fourth, early 1800s. So even though a country is at war with another, because the soldiers have traveled to these foreign areas, sometimes they visually pick up on the styles that Napoleonic furniture had a saber leg that was based upon the Greek style of furniture. And so the Brits pick this up as well, and we pick it up. So it's a symbol of military might and beautiful woods that Duncan Phyfe used. He set up his shop in New York City and he had, oh, probably a few dozen people working for him. And this became the chic furniture to have. Again, still British inspired. A table that has the American eagle symbol. And this is a card table, so it folds out like the one we had seen a little bit earlier. And a sofa. And even in the detail of the sofa, there is a carving of a horn of plenty, a cornucopia. There is a fascia, and that is a bundle of reeds bound up with a string or leather string or whatever. And the meaning of that is that together we stand, that we are stronger as a group. One of those reeds individually will break. So that goes back to classical times, to Greco-Roman times. And we find this in the symbols during the French Revolution and all that. And again, striped fabric, still very popular. And what's called a Christmas curl on the sides of the furniture. We saw this in French furniture of the time, Napoleonic furniture. So this Christmas leg is getting a little exaggerated here, and not really a Christmas leg, it's just a curvy leg. But these curls that go here, and then the back also curves around a little bit. The other aforementioned designer was Charles Lanouillet. Now, he came from France, and his furniture is even more Napoleonic looking. The French will use gilt bronze mounts. And as I say here, this is gilded brass. So the French would take brass sculpture and through a very poisonous process, take gold and mercury and form a liquid, lay it over the bronze, and then heat it. And the fumes coming up from that was very poisonous. France eventually outlawed it. It hasn't been outlawed yet. It's more later in the 1800s when it was outlawed. So here are these kind of victory figures. Oh, a Greek lyre, kind of like a Greek harp. A pier table is one that's used in between two windows. And here's some detail, although that's a little bit Louis the 14th, but again, Charles Lanouillet is French. So these gilt bronze mounts, again, kind of a winged victory figure. Here's a sleigh bed that was very typical in the Napoleonic era in France, again, early 1800s. And some very interesting dolphin-looking feet. Well, not only does France have a lot of dolphins because it translates into the Dauphin, Dauphin, the prince who will become king, but also Greek sailors considered dolphins to be protective figures. So even though it's more of a blunt-nosed dolphin here, that's kind of a double meaning. It's a French image, and because dolphins being very playful represent the prince, but then in another context, the dolphins would Greek symbol of protection for sailors. And Lanouillet decorated the Red Room of the White House. So here are all of these pieces of furniture. that look very French Napoleonic. And what I mean by that is that the upholstery would match the pillows and lots of deep colors, ruby reds and emerald greens and sapphire blues. And so the Red Room still pretty much looks like this. They've reupholstered it a couple of times. And a little short stop in Greek Revival. So the next American period was in 1830, and that's when we were sympathetic to what the Greeks were going through in their fight for freedom from Turkish rule. We had just gone through our own revolution, so we sympathized with the Greeks, and so we again take up this banner of classical architecture, but this is very pumped up classical architecture. So here's your triangular pediment and the heavy columns that go all the way across the front. Now see, in American Classical Revival, it's just a portico, it's a porch. But in Greek Revival, those columns go all the way across the front. You'll see a lot of Southern architecture like this. And so if you ignore the leopard carpet for a moment, we have a beautiful piece of Greek Revival furniture. I don't think pink was really used at the time, but I also wanted to show you that sometimes the styles are intermixed with each other. Everything else in this room is Napoleon. So all of these pieces are more American Classical Revival. The next step is Greek Revival. And that is a daybed such as we see here with that curl. You can see there's a little curl right there. Pink is not really a color of the era. But again, all of these classical details. Right here is a palmette, a palmette. Right there is a kind of a rose medallion that you'll see in classical design, a flower medallion, and various Greco-Roman looking designs, specifically more Greek. And note also that Klismos legs, because that's a Greek word for chair. And then in the painting, and this is all painted on, this is black in the background to make the gold paint stand out. We have these creatures, these griffins, these, generally they're winged lions, but sometimes there's a eagle's face with a lion's body. That's part of the mythology coming out of classical times. And then here again, we see that palmette and some more swags. But Greek Revival furniture is a bit more accentuated. So here's your typical form. The next period we go on into is the Victorian. So that's about 1840 to about the turn of the century after the Greek Revival. But again, sometimes people will mix up their styles. And here's an example of a beautiful, oh, I forgot to put in this is San Francisco. So this is an example of a Queen Anne style of Victorian. The pattern books also came over for Victorian styles. So those pattern books, and this is why the Victorians are rather eclectic, because people would take these books, unlike the furniture books, but they would take these books and there would be a page full of doors and a page full of chimneys and a page full of windows. And you can kind of imagine a couple sitting down and saying, oh, those are pretty doors. Oh, that one, that one, that one, and that one. And let's use that chimney, that chimney, that chimney, that chimney. And you come up with a very eclectic style of architecture. So the Queen Anne has a turret, because we find a lot of turrets in England, this rounded area. And it's a very feminine style. Queen Anne was a very feminine queen. There was a wonderful movie with Olivia Colman that made Queen Anne look crazy, and that's not the way she was. She was a very domestic and feminine queen. And so the Queen Anne architecture is very feminine with the scallops that you see right here and the detail. Now, the Americans and others, Europeans, are now able to travel more extensively because of the railroads. And not everybody went to university. You might have obtained your education through travel, as we still do today. And we'll find again a lot of eclectic styles. People will go to Greece and Rome, but also to the Middle East and to look at a non-Western style of design, primarily an Islamic-based design. And this is what gives us so many of the eclectic pieces that we'll be looking at with Victorian furniture. We, of course, don't have a Queen Victoria, but the term is used roughly for the time that she was on the throne, which is 1837 to 1901. And in England, just a very difficult period. It was the Industrial Revolution. It was the era of Jack the Ripper. There was great changes in society. And we, of course, had some of our own changes going on. And the furniture has not only an English influence, but also a French influence as well. So with this travel, they would take the designs that they had seen, and then they would incorporate it and interpret it for their own. So yes, it's quite tufted. There's a lot of buttons in here, very elaborate fabrics on them, over decoration, because the whole point was to bring home all of the things that you had seen and put out all of your tchotchkes together. And this is why Victorian homes are so filled up, are so busy, is because you brought home your things and you wanted everybody to see what you had collected. They also tend to be dark because the velvet curtains would keep out the air. Before we knew more about germs and bacteria and things like that, it was thought that you got sick from something called miasma, which was bad air. Now, yeah, you can get sick from bad air because in England you have a lot of industrialization going on at the time as well. But this is a general bad air. And of course, now we know that there's germs and bacteria and other things that will make us sick. So that's another reason why sometimes the curtains are drawn. The air is meant to be kept out. What we've been looking at in the last couple of slides is Rococo revival furniture. I'll type that into the chat box. And this isn't quite what Louis XV furniture looks like, but it's very lacy and frilly in the carving because Louis XV furniture is very lacy and feminine. Probably the most well-known purveyor of this furniture was John Henry Belter, a German immigrant. Americans weren't afraid of technology. We're a very young nation. And in Europe, there was great concern of using any sort of technology to make something because it was thought that you would lose your handcrafted way of life. Europeans have a very long tradition of handcrafted objects. We don't as Americans. Now, obviously, our Native Americans do, but as a country, we're still pretty young. So we embraced new kinds of saws and new kinds of lathes that would help us make our furniture. I've read, I've not been able to verify that we would pay more for a suite of furniture that was made by machine, more so than by hand, because it was newfangled, and we Americans always like that newfangled stuff. Another style was Renaissance Revival, and that's where there's little crest is right there. And usually, I'll show you a close up in just a moment, there would be a medallion that might have a Roman soldier's head, or that medallion could be painted. And also Egyptian revival. Now I'm going to come back to this table in just a few moments. I wanted to talk about the Renaissance revival first. So as you can see here, there's like a crest, and then in here, like a cameo, could be a Greco-Roman looking woman or a soldier's helmet, sometimes just a pretty landscape painted there. Here's another example of some of the Renaissance revival pieces. So here it is with this sort of triangular crest. Now, the Suez Canal was opened in 1868, and so that created an interest in Egyptian revival. So here we see the pharaoh's heads and a sphinx here and various Egyptian-looking designs. And another set where the embroidery gives us the vulture god and this kind of Anubis god, this god of the underworld, and then a pharaoh's head on it as well. And then we had Charles Eastlake. Charles Eastlake was a British designer, kind of the Martha Stewart of his time. And the kind of crest that you see right here, kind of a squarish crest, and there's various permutations of it. He wrote a book called Hints on Household Taste in the middle of the 1800s. And he didn't think anything should be round. He hated round turrets. He thought that everything should be square. So even though we've got a little bit of round arms right there, generally Eastlake style furniture will be square with a square crest. See, the Renaissance revival is a triangle that comes up. A Wooten desk was a way to store all of your objects, and so this also has a kind of crest at the top. Now let's go to the arts and crafts period around the turn of the century as a rebellion against over-decorated Victorian styles. And of course, you know, Victorian is so much fun too, but there is a feeling of wanting to move away from the Victorian era, and especially in England, as it was inspired by people such as William Morris, that was rebelling against the machine-made objects. Now, we have a different aesthetic. For England, it was trying to like cure some of the problems of industrialization. Here for us, it's more of a uniquely American style, as Frank Lloyd Wright would have had us think in terms of design. He said, we don't have any Greco-Roman design. We don't have these European influenced designs. We should have a uniquely American style, one that looks like a house just grew up out of a house bulb or a house seed, using the colors and the materials of the earth, getting rid of a lot of the clutter, open floor plans. And so in the Gamble house, we have also the idea of blurring the distinction between inside and out. And so stained glass will help us accomplish that. And up in the Bay Area, there's the Thorson House in Berkeley. And so the Green brothers were the main purveyors here in California of this arts and crafts style, honoring craftsmanship, the beauty of the wood, the construction of the wood as well, and unifying elements so that there should not be that eclecticism. So for example, in the Gamble house, let's see, let's go back to the front. It's a little bit hard to see here, but there's a unifying element of a Japanese cloud lift. So yes, Japanese influences as well. So here's the cloud lift with the rays of the sun burning through. And another unifying element is that Mr. Gamble had collected Japanese sword stoppers, what are called tsubas, T-S-U-B-A. So there's Japanese influences in arts and crafts. Frank Lloyd Wright had worked in Japan and he was a great purveyor of Japanese screens and objects. And so the shape of the table and the light fixture is in the shape of a tsuba. That's even seen in this beautiful little detail in the headboard, this shape of a tsuba, little bits of turquoise and mother of pearl. So utilizing the colors and the materials of the earth. The furniture, no, is not very comfortable. Frank Lloyd Wright realized that as his own body started to age. So early pieces are very strict in their form. And Gustav Stickley is another main designer of this kind of furniture. Very, very simple. So this idea of getting rid of all of the gewgaws on Victorian furniture, this is one of the reasons why the arts and crafts furniture looks this way. Even the decorative arts, such as the lamp, here we have a beautiful shale called mica with a copper base. And even here, seeing the construction methods. So that was important in the arts and crafts era. So here, the mortise and tenon is not hidden. You can even see the pin going in here. Gustav Stickley published and illustrated a magazine called The Craftsman. So this is where the term craftsman furniture comes from. He had a little split with his brothers. So there's Gustav Stickley furniture and there's L and JG furniture, L and JG for his brothers. Just the honesty of the wood, the simple ideas of shapes of leaves and not a whole lot of decoration here. Charles Rolfs, incorporating some elements of Asian design. As I mentioned, we do see. This is a bit more of a Chinese symbol. But again, just the beauty of the wood. That was the importance of the craftsman style of furniture. And then we go to Art Deco. So our two last periods now, we'll look at Art Deco and finally mid-century modern. And Art Deco started in France. It was after World War I that the decorative artists wanted to have an exhibition of furniture and pottery and fabrics. And this also translated into architecture and streamlining, aerodynamics, eliminating, again, all of that elaborate Victorian stuff. Now, I love a good Victorian, but people wanted to move into the future. We have many aerodynamic forms, cars and planes, and even fast animals. Cheetahs and jaguars and greyhounds were symbols of the Art Deco era. And because King Tut's tomb had been opened up in 1922, there was also that flattening out of form like we see in hieroglyphics. We recognize those figures are human figures, but they're flattened out. So stylization, flattening out, and the Egyptians used a lot of sunbursts, and that's where the sunbursts come into the Chrysler Building. There was a great collaboration between Paris and New York because they're close by geographically. Just a little fun fact is that even though most people read these as sunbursts because the Egyptians used a lot of sunbursts, these are actually hubcap designs for a Chrysler automobile because it's the Chrysler Building. And even here, the gargoyles, those are actually hood ornaments. So we divide the Art Deco period into two periods. The 1920s is what we call the zigzag moderne, and the 1930s is called the streamline moderne. The 1920s was the Jazz Age. It was a good economy, the Harlem Renaissance, and more exuberant. The 1930s, no less elegant, but more streamlined, more pared down. Another reason why I brought up the Chrysler Building is that zigzag moderne is more vertical, and streamline moderne is more horizontal. So this is a good example of a more decorative zigzag moderne Art Deco. And this is a good example of a more streamlined moderne 1930s Art Deco. And furniture can kind of be divided between the two as well. I also want to bring up the influence of the movie industry in giving us so many beautiful Art Deco interiors. So a geometrization of form, club chairs. If there's one type of furniture for the Art Deco era, it's club chairs. Other countries don't tend to divide the Art Deco periods the way that we do. Americans divide this into the 1920s and the 1930s. Other countries maybe kind of just slide into it. So here, beautiful details. You almost feel like Jean Harlow is going to be lounging upon this day bed. And here's that zigzag, that kind of chevron shape that we see in the 20s. Abel Fady gave us these skyscraper chairs and settee. And the French Art Deco, I have to say, is going to be more elegant. They'll use exotic skins. They'll use shark skins and even monkey fur, and we'll use leathers. We'll use pig and cow leather. The French will use very exotic woods, and we tend to stick with our local woods, but the French would import various woods from all around the world. They would use a very elegant lacquer. I mean, there's just amazing lacquered furniture in French furniture. Americans, we use kind of an industrialized lacquer. So it's beautiful furniture. It's just maybe not French furniture, let's put it that way. And here's a fun piece by Abel Fady. Again, here's our zigzags. Think of the lights coming up when there's a movie premiere. And when the telephone rings, this set of doors, these two doors open up to show you the telephone. I love that. In Oakland, this set of furniture actually been found in the alley. They were remodeling the Paramount Theater, and the new general manager found this in the alley and brought it back up. So here again is your little zigzag. And again, sunbursts, beautiful woods here. I wish I knew a little bit more about it, but I picked it because it's a good example of this kind of sunburst motif. Paul Frankel, another very important designer. And many of these designers were not only furniture designers, they were architects, they were industrial designers. We've got a whole bunch of stuff happening in the 1930s, especially with industrial design. So here's a, very geometric type of bookcase. And Donald Deskey, one of our main industrial designers of the Art Deco era, he designed things from toothpaste tubes to cars to vacuum cleaners, just about anything you could think of. We as Americans did not exhibit at an Art Deco exhibition that I briefly mentioned. Our then Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, didn't think we had anything to exhibit. And then he realized that he made a mistake because we are a hotbed of Art Deco. Then in the 1930s, it'll be more streamlined. We might not see as much. For example, here we have some metal leaf. And here's some of our club chairs. Paul Frankel giving us this speed chair, again, referencing aerodynamics. This one using chrome metal. Many new materials had been developed in both World War I and World War II that would give us new materials to use in peacetime production. and what were called waterfall cabinets, where it just kind of flows right over. And Walter Dornan Teague, another one of our famous industrial designers who also worked in furniture. There's also a little bit of a futuristic aspect about Art Deco. The movie Metropolis, the German expressionist movie about, well, basically robots taking over the world, Buck Rogers. And so this is kind of looking to the future, moving away from the past. That's what that Art Deco exhibition was about, was moving into the future. And a cabinet by Paul Frankel. Our colors reference our history, and that would be Native American design. Each one of the participants in the Art Deco exhibition in 1925 in New York were told, leave the past behind, bring us new aerodynamic objects. Well, what happened basically is that people kind of stylized their basic culture. So for us, it would be, if you think about the Southwest Native Americans, Navajo, Zuni, Hopi, for example, coral and obsidian and silver are seen in a lot of the jewelry. So in our last few minutes, let's look at mid-century modern furniture now. A lot of the mid-century modern furniture came about after World War II through the designs of a magazine called Arts and Architecture. And this was a very avant-garde magazine. It would be kind of like what Dwell is today and what wallpaper is today. And even here in the front, this collage type design would remind us of the abstract expressionists of the era, such as Jackson Pollock and Robert Motherwell. This was designed by Ray Eames of Charles and Ray Eames fame. She was an artist. And this magazine put forth the idea of the case study house program. And this was an idea that John Intenza, the publisher and editor of Arts and Architecture magazine, put out the call to California architects, primarily Southern California architects. And he wanted people to use materials that had been designed and utilized in World War II, now to be used for peacetime production. A big idea of it was that it was supposed to be child friendly because this is the baby boomer generation, but these avant-garde houses aren't quite so child friendly. The other side of that, which I'll show you in just a moment, is the ranch houses. And so using modern materials, new kinds of tempered glass, new kinds of electroplating. This is one of the famous case study houses. There were 36 proposed, of which 25 of them were built. The Eames House in Pacific Palisades by Charles and Ray Eames was one of those. And very simple furniture, meant to be easily cleanable, easily stackable, easily mass produced. Now, these pieces have become very expensive because they're sold through outlets such as Knoll and Design Within Reach. But at that time, because of the baby boomer market, it was meant to be inexpensive, child-friendly. So the other side of that, and I just have about 10 more slides here, I know we're running close on time, was the ranch houses. And those are the houses that were proposed to a great extent by an architect whose name was Cliff May, who was a third generation Californian. And these are the houses that are more child friendly. One of the aspects being an open floor plan, and that would have come from the arts and crafts movement. And these windows that would allow you to keep an eye on your kids in the backyard. Here, this fireplace going both ways, again, that open floor concept. And so these ranch houses, we've got many of the developers who gave us the ranch houses, Joseph Eichler being one of them. And the layout is car friendly. So here you would drive into the driveway, you would unload your groceries in the kitchen. Here would be the dining room area. Here's the entrance where you could go into the living room. And then over here would be the private spaces. That's your basic layout of the ranch style houses, promoted through a great extent by Sunset Magazine. And so this speaks to the car culture as well. And the looking forward to the future. So we've got the Cadillac fins of the car culture, the light fixtures that are very spaceship looking, and these ceilings that kind of go up at an angle is typical of the ranch house style. So the furniture of the era would give us the Eames designs, and they were working with bent wood. And so here, utilizing the chrome legs, just very simple, easily put together, mass production. The bent wood takes a little bit more. You need to take slices of wood and put them into a vise, glue them together, and then either bend them with water or electricity. Charles Eames wanted a chair where he could feel like he was just sitting in an old baseball glove. So that's where the Eames chair came about. He had actually developed this bent wood to help soldiers with broken limbs during World War II. And again, a very simple storage unit made out of particle board. And then lastly, Florence Knoll came along, and she gave us the idea that you might see in a lot of the Mad Men interiors. And that was to open up offices in business buildings, moving away from all of that heavy oak furniture and the big desk that somebody would sit behind with their cigar. And she had worked with many famous architects because she had worked for them. And so even though the Barcelona chair comes from an earlier era in the 1920s, but she had apprenticed with Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. And she's also very important because she made these very agreeable agreements between Scandinavian designers who might not have been able to bring their furniture to market, but made it so that they could produce their furniture, be paid by the Knoll Company, and bring us the designs that we know for mid-century modern today. She designed furniture pieces that she said would be fill-ins. So these are her designs. And Eero Saarinen, whose father was the head of Cranbrook Academy in Detroit, and Eero designed that wonderful TWA terminal at JFK. So just very simple designs, none of that tufted furniture, none of that elaborate Victorian style. He designed the tulip chair. He had been to a dinner party where he saw a table set with 12 chairs, saw those 48 legs, and he called it a slum of legs. So that's where he came up with the tulip chair. Part of his pedestal group. So just one leg, much more elegant. And again, there is an aerodynamics about this. Eero Saarinen also, Florence Knoll said to him, I want a chair I can curl up into. And so hence the womb chair. And again, very simple tubular steel legs. She asked Harry Bertoia to give her a chair that looks like air would flow right through it. And hence he did. And here's the cover for that chair. Even though Arne Jacobsen is Danish, she, again, I just wanted to emphasize this point that she gave these very agreeable agreements where the Scandinavian designers could bring their products to market on their own. They might not have been able to, but through Knoll Company, they could. And this is a take on the Queen Anne wing chair. So see these areas coming out like that. And this is a swivel chair as well. And then Isamu Noguchi's coffee table, very delicately balanced on these two wedges. And the fun marshmallow sofa that could come in different colors. And that leads us to our end, as I've got the clock by George Nelson Associates in front of us here. So again, this was a very quick trip through furniture, but I so appreciate your being here and all of your great questions as well.